gentlemen, and welcome once again to a debate sponsored by the Cleveland City Club and the Cleveland Public Library. This series of summer debates is in memory of Sidney Andorn, who conducted them for many years and was a well-known media personality in Cleveland. The subject today is, does Ohio need a stronger gun control law? And the participants will be Baron Coughlin, an outstanding Cleveland attorney, and Michael Edelstein, representing the National Rifle Association. Let me explain briefly once again, for those of you who have not been here before, what the ground rules are. Each speaker is entitled to present his case in a period of 12 minutes, following which we welcome questions from the audience for about half an hour, and then each speaker sums up his case for about 3 minutes. This is the seventh in our series of debates held here in the Eastman Reading Garden. We'll conclude this series next week, next Friday at the same time. It looked a little perilous this morning as to whether we'd be able to go ahead, but fortune has smiled on us once again, and I might know, pressing my luck in saying this, I might tell you rather, and I hope I don't press my luck, that in all the years that these debates have been staged here, we've never missed a day because of inclement weather. Keeping my fingers crossed. It's customary for the affirmative to take the podium first in these debates, and we therefore will hear first from Baron Coughlin, who was a member of the very prominent Cleveland law firm of Thompson, Hine, and Flory. Mr. Coughlin was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, but to all intents and purposes is a Clevelander through and through, having been here since 1939. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and he has been very active in handgun control for a number of years. He serves as a trustee of the Handgun Control Federation of Ohio, as well as a trustee of the Gun Safety Institute. I now present to you Mr. Baron Coughlin, who will address the affirmative position on the question, does Ohio need a stronger gun control law? Mr. Coughlin.
I'm not really going to read all those papers. I just thought we better have some statistics available to settle any arguments. If Mike and I start throwing things at each other, we'll be able to settle any disputes. It's important to note that what we're talking about here is whether the gun control law of Ohio should be strengthened. I think a great many people do a lot of arguing about gun control in Ohio without realizing that we do have a gun control law. In fact, I've got it here, and I'll show it to you. It's 23 pages of it, including the annotations of a number of cases, that have been decided under it. We think that the gun control law we have is pointed in the right direction, but it is not effective because it needs procedural strengthening. I'm going to come back to what the gun control law is that we now have. I want to mention one statistic first, and it's the only thing I'm going to get into having to do with why something needs really to be done about handguns in the United States. In 1979, I picked this as the year because it's the latest year for which we have any comparable figures available. 10,728 people were killed in the United States by handguns. 10,728. In the same year, the number of people who lost their lives to handguns in Japan was 48. In Great Britain, 8. Switzerland, 34. Canada, 52. Israel, 58. Sweden, 21. West Germany, 42. and the United States 10,728, more than were killed in the average year among the American forces in the Vietnam War. Obviously, something is wrong. It cannot be that people in the United States are just that much more deadly than the people in Canada and Great Britain and West Germany. They're the same kind of decent people, and too many people are being killed. We've got to do something. The question is, what can we do that is politically possible and practical from an enforcement point of view? We do think that the Ohio law can be strengthened in a way that will help. I do not say that it's going to solve all the problems of the people in the state of Ohio. It's not going to solve the problems of poverty. It's not going to solve the problems of injustice. It's not going to solve the problems of violent crime even. But it is going to help, we think, if we can enforce that law. Now we want to talk about the kind of law that we have in Ohio. Our law in Ohio includes a provision on carrying concealed weapons. I don't think anybody thinks we shouldn't have a prohibition on carrying concealed weapons. We have a law in Ohio that has to do with carrying loaded guns in automobiles, and I don't think anyone wants to get rid of that provision. Both of those provisions are really used as backup provisions by the police. When you catch some fellow who is fleeing from a crime and you can't prove he committed the crime, but you find the gun in his car or on his person, you use one of these things to catch him with. Otherwise, it is very hard to get somebody for carrying a gun in his automobile, even though it is a very dangerous thing to have going on. Now, we also have something in Ohio which is much more important, and I think is the significant part of it. We have a provision that no person may have or use or receive a firearm who is a fugitive from justice, who has been convicted of a felony of violence, who has been convicted of an offense relating to drug abuse, or is a drug addict, or is a chronic alcoholic, or is mentally incompetent. We also have a provision that nobody can provide any one of those people with a firearm. Those people have been referred to by the Ohio Supreme Court as the bad risk types, and I'm going to use that term for that group plus one other, who are the children. We also have a law in Ohio that you can't furnish a handgun to a person under 21 years old or any firearm to a person under 18. There's no law saying that the children can't have the gun. They didn't want to charge the child with it, but they do have a prohibition on giving it to them. So we have a law that is an attempt at keeping these dangerous weapons out of the hands of those who are much more dangerous when they have them. We are trying to keep the guns away from the bad risk types. Now, let's look at the people who are apt to have handguns in Ohio. There are really four groups of people. There's the law enforcement people in the Army in one category, the authorities. Nobody is talking about doing anything about their handguns. There is what might be called the sportsman's group. That is, people who use pistols for sport, mostly competitive shooting, pistol matches, that kind of thing. Those people are usually highly trained in safety precautions. They belong to gun clubs. There should be no objection to permitting people like that, who live by the set of rules that those people do, to continue to have handguns if they want to. A third category are the bad risk types, the people that are referred to in that section of the Ohio Code, the felons, the drug addicts, the alcoholics, and the children. And the fourth group are the other people who have guns, the great mass of people who don't have guns for sport or because of their job, but who have guns because they are afraid of the bad risk people in the third group. They're trying to defend themselves, and they think, and I'm not going to argue here whether they are right in thinking, the fact we are confronted with is that they do think that it is going to protect them. And they want to have the gun because of the bad risk people. The position of the Handgun Control Federation is that the gun control problem does involve those people. We hope there will be fewer people who will have handguns in their houses for protection, but we think it is not practical to try to get those people to give up their handguns unless we can do something about the bad risk types. Well, we have a statute involving the bad risk types, and it says they're forbidden to have a gun. Does anybody really think if you tell a fugitive from justice or a convicted felon that he can't have a gun, that he will go out and commit his murders and robberies without a handgun? If he's going to take the risk of holding somebody up on the street, he isn't going to be deterred by the thought that he's committing a much less serious crime of doing it with a handgun. It's already bad enough that he's holding somebody up on the street. You've got to stop it in another way. Well, we try to stop it by saying you can't sell that man a handgun. But how do we do it? The federal law has the same provision for dealers, and it says the dealer has a little form, and it says on it, I am not a fugitive from justice, I am not an escaped felon, I am not a drug addict, I am not a chronic alcoholic, I am not under 21, and the felon signs that. And then the dealer goes ahead and lets him have the gun, because that's really all he can do. And the good dealers don't like it because they don't want to be selling guns to those people, and the bad dealers don't care. There are a few bad risks among the dealers. Our solution is we give everybody an ID card who wants one, who is not a bad risk, and let the police do the investigating. If they can't find he's a bad risk, they give him an ID card. If he's got an ID card, he can have a gun. This protects the dealer. The dealer looks at the ID card and says, all right, you've got an ID card, I can sell you the gun, and I will be protected. But if you don't have that ID card, if you haven't been investigated by the police, you cannot have a gun. Now, coupled with that is registration of the handgun, so that once you've bought your gun, if you bought it for somebody else who is not entitled to an ID card, you bought it for your cousin who is about to escape from the Ohio penitentiary, so when he comes out, you give him the handgun. He commits a crime with it, and they find it, and it's your handgun, and you are responsible for having transferred that to a person without an ID card. The registration is the only way that you can enforce the ID card provision, and the ID card is the way of separating the bad risks who must not have guns under the Ohio law from the other people who have handguns only because they are afraid of the bad risks. That's what we're proposing in Ohio. A bill is already pending in the Ohio legislature to strengthen the existing handgun laws in that respect. We don't think it will 100% prevent the bad risks from getting handguns. They can still steal them. There are still ways that people can violate any law. But we think that by using the ID card and the registration, we are making it an awful lot harder for the criminal to get a handgun. And when you remember that of the guns picked up by the police in crimes, the average age of that gun since it was manufactured is less than 6 months, you realize that most of these people got their gun recently. And if we can stop them from getting one when they've thrown the old one that committed a murder in the lake, and they try to get a new one if they find it harder to get, we are going to have fewer handgun crimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coughlin. Taking the opposing view on the question, does Ohio need a stronger gun control law, is Michael Edelstein. He was born in St. Louis, educated in New York, has a degree in psychology from Touro College. He is now affiliated with the Lee-Mar Steel Company here in Cleveland, and he's been a member of the National Rifle Association and has expounded their point of view for the last 10 years. I now present to you Mr. Michael Edelstein.
Does Ohio need a stronger gun law? Before we can answer this, let's look at the current law. Chapter 2923.13 of the Ohio Revised Code states that anyone who is a convicted felon, a fugitive from justice, convicted of any offense with a drug of abuse, is a drug dependent, is a chronic alcoholic, or is mentally incompetent, then he or she may not acquire, possess at any time, carry or use a firearm. To do so is a felony. This law, I feel, is very clearly addressed to the criminal element of our society, and it is a fair and just law, in my opinion. And to broaden its application could only restrict the law-abiding citizen who is not a criminal. And that is completely unnecessary. Why restrict a person who does not commit crimes of his or her privilege to own a gun? Additional restrictive or stronger gun control laws are completely unnecessary. I will now back up my position with some documented national statistics. There are 55 million handguns, 180 million firearms, that's handguns and rifles, in the United States. According to the latest FBI crime data, the statistics which Mr. Coughlin used, less than 0.5% of all handguns were involved last year in any criminal activity. That means that 99.6% of all handguns were not misused in any crime whatsoever. In addition to the number of murders that Mr. Coughlin had stated, that number comprises only 60% of all the murders. 40% of all murders in this country have nothing to do with handguns whatsoever. According to the Decision-Making Information, or DMI survey, which was confirmed by the Pat Cadell survey, 53% of all handgun owners bought their guns for protection, while 12% of them, or 4.5 million people, said they actually used them for that purpose. It is also important to note that the 1981 National Safety Council official figures, only 60% of all homicides, as I had mentioned before, involved any type of firearm, while the National Safety Council reported that only 1,800 people died in firearm accidents, of which 600 were from hunting accidents. It also reported that twice as many people died from poisoning, 4 times as many, that number, drowned, and 27.5 times more died in car accidents. It was facts like these which prompted the Social and Demographic Research Institute of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, under a Justice Department grant to conclude in June 1981 that, quote, policy decisions about handgun control laws are being made in what amounts to an information vacuum. The truth is that we have allowed a very important issue to be guided by our emotions rather than the facts. All handguns bought since 1968 are registered with the local dealer for the federal government. Anyone who buys a gun today must sign a federal document stating that they are not a criminal. Now, in spite of what was mentioned before, it's very simple to state and very clear and very appropriate to say that registration, stricter registration, is not the answer, simply because such a small percentage of people who register or who come into the dealer and who sign documents abuse that privilege, simply lie about the fact that they are not criminals. In light of this and other facts, why place additional restrictions on 35 million handgun owners who would never contemplate, much less commit, a violent criminal act? And who then would have guns if law-abiding citizens would have to turn in their handguns? The answer here is not stricter laws as far as gun control goes. The answer is to deal with the criminal element who uses their guns for violent crimes. This requires tough laws which stipulate mandatory prison terms to anyone convicted of using a handgun or rifle in the commission of a crime. According to the Department of Justice Victimization Survey and the Rand Corporation studies, less than 3% of violent crimes will result in prosecution, conviction, and punishment, while more than 75% of violent crimes are committed by career criminals who have been convicted of a felony and are on some form of conditional or early release. We need strong, enforceable crime control laws, not additional gun control laws. The problem does not stem from the gun, but the criminal who abuses it. Ohio needs stronger enforceable crime control laws, not stronger gun control laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Edelstein. Before we go to our question and answer session, which is traditional in these City Club debates, ladies and gentlemen, let me just make a couple of small announcements. I neglected to introduce myself. I can assure you it's not out of modesty. It was simply an oversight. My name is Herb Cam, and I'm immediate past president of the Cleveland City Club. Next week, our series here in the Eastman Reading Garden will conclude with a debate on the condition of the Cleveland schools. And we have been fortunate enough to have the commitment of Eugene Kolash, the president of the Cleveland Teachers Union, and at least a tentative commitment from Ted Bonda, the president of the school board, that they will participate. This debate will take place on Friday, August 30, on the virtual eve of the reopening of Cleveland schools, and with important new developments in the desegregation process. And I'm sure everyone who cares about our Cleveland school system will want to hear what these two gentlemen have to say. I would remind you once again that these debates are sponsored by the Cleveland Public Library and the Cleveland City Club, and in memory of Sidney Ann Dorn, who presided over them and indeed conceived the idea of having these debates here in this most appropriate and lovely of settings in the heart of downtown Cleveland. Now, we have a microphone available here. I trust those of you in the audience who have any question at all about this issue will be willing and eager to come forward and ask a question. You may direct your question to either contestant or to both of them. We trust you will keep your questions fairly brief, but do not hesitate to come forward, please. Yes, sir.
I would direct my question to Mr. Edelstein. Mr. Edelstein, how do you account for the dramatic difference between the homicides by firearms in the United States and those in the countries that Mr. Coughlin mentioned?
Well, gun availability really has no relationship to murder or suicides. Now, the countries which were mentioned, Switzerland, Sweden, and Sweden and Israel, which we had heard only had a few murders, we also have to remember that every single household in these two countries have guns. In addition to that, Japan, which has a virtual ban on handguns, has a higher violent crime rate, higher murder rate than amongst the Japanese Americans in this country who have access to firearms. So I don't think that there is any relationship between one or the other.
Addressed to both speakers. I quote from the Plain Dealer of August 18th, Darrell Holland's article that had this item about gun control stated by Democratic Congressman Louis Stokes. A midnight cowboy is more determined to register your sons than your guns. May we have your comment on this?
I'm not sure what the quotation means. Do you have more of it there? Neither Mike nor I quite understands what this is about.
I underlined it there.
He's talking about leadership, and he says this country is in the dark because a midnight cowboy is more interested in Chinaware than China, more dedicated to nuclear proliferation than to nuclear arms elimination, more concerned with bigot rights than voting rights, and more determined to register your sons than your guns. This sounds like a somewhat political address by my friend Lou Stokes, and I think the part that refers to the guns is a contrast between the president's proposal for registry of young men and his reported opposition to registering handguns. I think it is significant that the Attorney General's study, which Mr. Edelstein mentioned, came out in favor of the permit approach. It said that they didn't think registration was necessary, but they did think something needed to be done. Now, I think it's rather clever to make that kind of pun on registering sons against registering guns. Whatever you think of either issue, I'm not sure that there's a logical connection between them, but I do think that the president, at least through his Attorney General, recognizes that something has to be done about the handgun problem. I'll pass this on to Mike if I may. He may want to look at it too.
Did you want to comment?
I think Mr. Coughlin took care of that comment.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yes, this is directed to Mr. Edelstein. And both the gentlemen up there are experts on handguns, and so am I, because I spent a month in the hospital, 2 major operations, and a trip through hell with for myself and my parents due to a handgun, not used by a criminal, but in a handgun accident. If my hometown had had a Morton Grove ordinance, it would have never happened to me. I'd like to ask Mr. Edelstein something. Who the hell is standing up for the rights of handgun victims like me? I have paid for your right to own handguns and the right of 35 million. I paid for it in a hospital bed. Answer that question for me, Mr. Edelstein. Answer if you can.
Well, I completely agree that the victims should have some type of compensation. I don't feel, however, that a gun law would have prevented it. Now, I was 2 years old when my uncle came home from the Marine Corps. He was a weapons instructor, he lived with us, and there were guns all over the house. I grew up with guns constantly, all around me. I was never a victim of any gun accident. My brother was never a victim of any gun accident. And it is unfortunate, and I agree that something should be done. However, what should be done is not stronger enforcement of laws, but I think something around or along the lines of gun safety promotion, which should be mandatory. I feel that anyone who owns a gun should know how the hell to use one. And in addition to that, they should know how to safely procure one, secure one. And I just don't feel, again, it's very unfortunate, but I just don't feel that this is the type of situation that's going to be remedied by a stronger gun control law.
Can't hear you. Sorry, can't hear you. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Edelstein, you had many, you quoted a lot of different figures and percentages. Do you have a figure, a percentage for the number of people that actually used their guns to protect themselves against a criminal in the case of an attack or a burglary? Do you have any percentages that show that?
Well, I quoted the RAND study, which stated that 4.5 million people, 12%, used or stated they used their handguns for protection. They actually used it. Not just bought it for protection, but actually used it. And that was confirmed by the Pat Cadell survey.
Would you say that that was a violent act? If not criminal, it was a violent act.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
You said that they did not contemplate using the gun that they bought for a violent criminal act, but at least it was a violent act that they contemplated when they got their gun.
You have to forgive me, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean. According to the surveys, 12% of the people, according to the survey, 30% of all people who buy handguns stated that they bought the handguns for protection. Out of that 30%, 12% actually used their handguns for protection.
This was which survey?
This was the DMI survey, confirmed by the Pat Cadell survey. Pat Cadell was also the survey person for Jimmy Carter when he was president.
I have a two-part question for Mr. Edelstein, which Mr. Coughlin may want to address also. Mr. Edelstein, you've just told us that the best way to solve the handgun crime problem is to support laws which call for the mandatory incarceration of those who use a firearm in the commission of a felony. As a representative of the NRA, I'd like to know your position on some of the following bills in the Ohio legislature. They are House Bill 136, House Bill 269, Senate Bill 27, and Senate Bill 190.
Well, I think you're going to have to be more specific because I'm not familiar specifically with those bills.
Okay, sir, for your information, these are 4 bills which call for the actual incarceration of those convicted of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. I'm a little surprised you're not aware of those, since you claim that that is just the sort of thing that you do support.
Well, the problem has been, again, and I think I stated this, the issue is not the crime control, the crime laws on the book. It's the enforcement of those laws. Now, if 3%, less than 3% of all violent criminals are going to wind up being convicted, there's a problem with enforcement, not necessarily the laws, but whichever one it's going to take, whether it's new, stronger laws, which predetermine which state specifically, mandatory prison sentences, whatever it is, they have to be enforced, plain and simple.
I guess I'm still mystified as to why the NRA isn't putting its money where its mouth is. Here's 4 bills that would do exactly what you claim you're in support of, and yet you're not even aware of them or even actively lobbying for them.
There is somebody who is actively lobbying for all bills. The NRA has different regional directors out of Washington, D.C., and regional representatives in various states who do actively lobby. I am not part of the active lobbying group within the state of Ohio.
I'm going to say something here in support of Mr. Edelstein. In the first place, I think it's fair to say that we've all got jobs and we all want things to be done, and we can't all get all the things that we want done through the legislature, and we're trying to do it. The Gun Control Federation of Ohio is trying very hard to get something done. I think perhaps the NRA, with whatever resources it has, will support something, because from what I have heard here today, Mr. Edelstein, at least, is in favor of something that we are strongly in favor of. That is, we both want to see the law enforced that keeps guns away from felons, drug addicts, the insane, the children, the chronic alcoholics. We all want to see that law enforced. Now, the difference between us seems to be boiling down to this. Mr. Edelstein says, we have a law that says those people can't have handguns. We must make it enforceable by raising the penalty. Our position is that when a man is a drug addict and he desperately needs the money to buy that drug, and he's got a handgun, he is going to go out and get the money with his handgun, and he is not going to be deterred by the fact that there's a mandatory sentence on it. If he's caught committing an armed robbery, he's exposed to the sentence anyway. And as Mr. Edelstein points out, it is very unlikely that he's going to be convicted of the crime even if they catch him. I think the way to keep that man from going out and earning his dope with a handgun is to keep him from buying the handgun in the first place. And the way to do that is to get the decent people to enforce the law by refusing to sell it to him, because it's a crime for them to do it if he doesn't have an ID card. Thank
you. Mr. Edelstein? I'm sorry, I came in a little late. I didn't catch the number of handguns that there are in the United States. Did you have that number?
There are 55 million handguns.
Okay.
And a total of 180 million firearms.
55 million handguns. And I think you did say that only 0.5% of that number were involved in last year in accidents or murders or something like that.
Right.
My next question is really arithmetic. Can you tell me what 0.5% of 55 million is, and whether you consider it an insignificant figure?
Well, the number stated before, 10,000, over 10,000.
Well,
I don't think it is
it's a
insignificant.
long way over 10,000, 55 million.
I don't think, and I'll tell you outright, I think one life is precious enough that something should be done. I'm not going to stand here and say that 10,000 people is nothing. Not at all. But again, I am looking at it in terms of the overall picture, in terms of the overall perspective, and I feel, again, in my opinion, and in the National Rifle Association's opinion, that the issue here cannot be dealt with a stricter law controlling the gun.
You made that point, but my point is, I wonder whether you agree that close to 300,000 is a big figure. That happens to be about 0.5% of 55 million.
No, 55 million handguns. No, you don't understand. It's not 55 million handguns that 300,000 handguns were involved in crimes. A lot of these guns were used over and over again.
Okay, I give up.
This question is for Mr. Coughlin. What is there to stop the bureaucracy from eventually confiscating all guns through zealously overregulating any potential gun control law?
The bureaucracy can confiscate all the guns if a law is passed telling them that all the guns are to be confiscated. We are not proposing a law to confiscate all the guns. We are proposing a law to help enforce the prohibition on the bad risks acquiring handguns. Mr. Edelstein also proposes a change in the law which will discourage the bad risks from having handguns. There is no more likelihood of confiscation under our program than under his program. The dispute between us is only which is more apt to be effective in keeping the guns out of the hands of the bad risks. Beyond that, I think I would say that we have got along with a law forbidding these people to have handguns for a long time. There has not been a confiscation arising from the fact that it's on the books. I don't think there is more likely to be confiscation arising from the fact that we make the law enforceable.
In other words, you're saying that they will not be able to, for instance, if you register a handgun this year under a gun control law, coming back several months or a year down the road saying all those that have handguns with a certain barrel length must now turn those weapons in.
We have no law to that effect. We have a law requiring registration of automobiles. Mine's registered, hasn't been confiscated yet. If I haul dope in it, I understand it can be. But if I use it in an armed robbery, no.
So in my example, then, the only way that that law could be changed would be through a vote or of some type? Or
the legislature would have to pass another law. There is no way that bureaucrats can confiscate anything, not in the United States.
Mr. Edelstein, I'm going to ask a philosophical question. Do you think that any well-financed lobby has ever been in the interests of the majority of the people?
Can you repeat the question?
I'll repeat. Do you think any well-financed lobby has ever been in the interests of the majority of the people?
Of the 7 major, in the past 5 years, 7 major surveys that were done on people's attitudes, I believe it was only the Harris poll that stated the majority of people wanted stronger gun control laws. The most liberal state in the Union, Massachusetts, put that question to vote, and they defeated the stronger handgun law. So I don't necessarily think that the NRA lobbying effort necessarily doesn't represent the majority. I think it does represent the majority.
Since John Hughes is into philosophy, I'd like to continue along that line. For both speakers, what is it in the American psyche that requires them to want these weapons? Is it an effort to prove their manhood, or? That's the first part of the question. Well, let me have that answer, if I might.
Good question. I was going to ask. You're the psychologist. Barry, I'd like you to try it too.
I think there is a certain aspect of the machismo about it, but he's the psychologist, and I am not. And I don't know for sure, but I think there is some of that, and there's a lot of it in television. I think television keeps telling us that the good guys can always fight it out with the bad guys and win. And this has not been good psychology for this country. I don't want to see anybody passing laws saying you can't have that stuff on television, but I do think it's influencing a lot of people, particularly less intelligent people. And that is in it too. May I say something about the previous question about lobbies? I think maybe we're being a little unfair here. I know the NRA has a lot of money, and I know it's a very powerful lobby. But in answer to that question, I want to say that if all of you will make a good, fat contribution to the Handgun Control Federation of Ohio, I'll let you know my answer to that question.
Mike, you want to try that? Why is it that so many Americans want guns?
According to the DMI survey, 48% of all Americans who bought firearms bought them for hunting, 30% for protection, 12% for target shooting, 4% for collecting, and 11% used guns for other uses. Now, I don't know what that means on the fourth one, but I will tell you that I don't know what motivates an individual to go out and buy a handgun. There are a lot of sick people in this world, unfortunately, who own handguns, who shouldn't own handguns. You know, just to ask what is the national psyche, I don't know. Many people have attempted to answer that question. Many people have come up with some very interesting ideas. You know, the macho image. I don't know. I don't think I'm a macho person. You know, I don't know. Most of my friends aren't either.
The second part of the question, and that is, you've spoken of the persons in our society who are bad risk, and they shouldn't have guns, and then you refer to the rest of the law-abiding good citizens who should be entitled to that privilege, I believe. Isn't it good psychology to say that all of us have a time at which we lose our control, maybe only momentarily, and if we had warm marshmallows, we might utilize those rather than handguns?
Well, first of all, not all murders were committed with handguns. And I think, quite honestly, that it's very important to realize that a lot of people, again, what I said before, shouldn't be owning handguns, and whether or not they've been trained properly in the use of guns. Now, I don't know what the statistics are in the hunters. There are very few hunting accidents. Most hunters are well prepared. They know what to do and what not to do. Now, I don't know. I personally feel that training, a proper training, probably supported by the police departments, local police departments. I know that there are several in the country who have civilian shooting programs. These type of programs are needed. I agree 100%. I don't think anybody should just go out and buy a gun without some type of prior knowledge of how to use that gun and the safety of it.
It seems apparent to me that both of the legislation that both of you are talking about assumes that most of the damage or risk to the citizenry from the proliferation of handguns comes from the, I can't recall the words that Mr. Coughlin used, but the criminal element, the uncertain element. I become increasingly concerned as I read the papers about the number of handgun accidents that there are in families, places that incidents which result in the death of children, very frequently, it seems to me, and I, for the record, would like to have Mr. Coughlin cite some statistics, if he has them, on the number of accidents that there are. And I also would like to know, what do you think that the legislation you're talking about would have to do, would ameliorate that problem in any way?
I don't think there's any doubt but that by far the largest number of handgun accidents and killings are caused by handguns which are not in the hands of criminals. To what extent these people may be unstable mentally or alcoholics is a little hard to separate, because these people are presumably law-abiding people, even though they fall into that category. I think your question suggests that you have to cut down on the handgun population generally if you are going to make a major cut in the number of tragedies that happen. I agree with that. But I do not think that banning the handgun held by the, quote, law-abiding part of the population is going to cut down on that population, because this group of people, I'm putting aside the sportsmen, the competitive shooters, the people like Mike Edelstein, the people who have a gun because they think it's going to protect them against the bad risks, are going to try to get it anyway. And the way to get them not to buy a gun if they don't already have it, or to give up their gun voluntarily if they don't already have it, or if they do already have it, rather, the way to accomplish that is to first get the guns out of the hands of the bad risks. If we can reduce that population of guns, then a lot of other people are going to say it isn't really worthwhile keeping. I'd like to add one more point, which is indirectly related to that, and that is that people like Mike Edelstein, who are highly trained in safety, know that the gun you keep in your house must be kept unloaded, in a safe place, preferably locked up, and with the ammunition somewhere else from the gun. If you do that, it's no good for protection. You've got to keep it at hand. So you can't do both.
We now have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to give each of these gentlemen a chance to summarize his position. Since you went first, Mr. Coughlin, we're going to allow you to go second on the summary. Mr. Edelstein, would you care to summarize your position in a minute or two, please?
My summary will be very brief. Most handgun owners, including the National Rifle Association, strongly support tough, mandatory prison terms for anyone using any firearm in the commission of a crime. This, we feel, is the only realistic approach to the problem of handgun abuse in our society. Punish criminals, not law-abiding citizens. On this issue, both sides, for and against handguns, should work together to see mandatory prison terms become a reality. In addition, we should also encourage our local police departments to set up programs to educate those who own guns on their proper use and safety. Those who want to buy handguns in the future should receive a certificate, something similar to what was proposed, from the police stating that they have taken the safety course before they can purchase any firearm. This is not registration. This simply states that people are educated and they have some knowledge in the use and safety of firearms. This can be accomplished without any additional handgun registration or additional gun control laws. Thank you very much.
I think I can be pretty brief at this point. I hope we've made it clear that the Gun Control Federation is not proposing a ban. We are proposing what we think are better mechanics for keeping the handguns out of the hands of the bad risks, in the hope that if we can accomplish something along those lines, we will then be able to cut down on the voluntary handgun population among the law-abiding people. I think we have made some progress, perhaps, in persuading Mike Edelstein, because I note that he has now taken the position that before anyone can buy a handgun, he should be required to take a course in how to use it. We are not proposing a course. We want everybody who has a right to have a handgun to be able to get an ID card if he wants it, even without taking a course. What we want investigated is not how well he can handle the gun, but how well he can handle himself. We want to know that he is not insane, an alcoholic, a drug addict, or a criminal. And that's all we want to know. As far as training him to handle a gun, I am sure that President Reagan is very grateful that Mr. Hinckley, is that his name, was not a better shot than he was. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Baron Coughlin, and thank you, Michael Edelstein, for participating in today's debate on the subject, does Ohio need a stronger gun control law? Let me remind you, my good friends, that next Friday we'll have a debate on the school situation, and it'll begin as usual at 12:30. These debates are broadcast live each week on WCLV, your fine arts station here in Cleveland, and are carried on a delayed basis on some 20 other stations throughout the greater Cleveland area. They are taped for a rebroadcast on WVIZ by the fine young men from Cuyahoga Community College, who you see here manning the cameras. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you again next week. Today's forum is adjourned.